Hello, welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sherry Grabow, and we're filming live from PwC's 6th Annual International Tax Conference. And joining me today to talk about how the global operating environment continues to be a challenge to many companies is Craig Stronberg. Craig, welcome.
Thank you.
Craig, the era where the world economy benefited from increased globalization has ended, at least for the time being. What macroeconomic forces are defining the current era, and how are companies responding?
So this is like one of the questions of the day, right? The companies are asking both of us and a lot of our colleagues. I think the way that we would probably phrase this is how you see this depends upon where you are in the world, right? Globalization at one point sort of looked the same to everybody because everybody was sort of equally benefiting. Now globalization has shifted to the point where I think two big things have happened. One is, for much of globalization's history, which goes back a long time, macroeconomics was sort of in the front seat, right? It was the primary driver of globalization. What has happened over the last couple of years is that macroeconomics and geopolitics are switching seats. Macroeconomics is going in the back seat, and geopolitics and decisions and national capitals about geopolitics is going in the front seat. And that sometimes leads to limitations on trade. I think the other thing that's happening is that the global economy's focus is shifting from where it often was historically. It's not that the US isn't probably going to still continue to be the world's number one market. I think it will. But increasingly, globalization is really focusing on intense regionalization in East and Southeast Asia, where you are seeing some of the most dynamic and interesting economies in the world, like Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, as well as more established economies like Japan, coming together to cooperate on trade to a degree that you aren't seeing as much globally. So it's not that it's ending writ large. I would say that it's shifting and changing, but it's going to require the companies pay a lot of attention to this, because if you're a global company, your view on globalization is going to depend upon where you really are in the world.
The global operating environment has been subjected to multiple shocks, leading to persistent disequilibrium since early 2020. What challenges will companies continue to face in 2023?
So I think part of what we all have to get accustomed to is like we're both lucky enough to be here today, in person. There were so many months, that went by when we weren't able to do this. And I think what is happening is that, businesses, governments, they're all people, right? And they want to get past the meteor strike that was COVID, and that's understandable. But the aftershocks of COVID have not all hit us yet. This was a massive change. And so I think part of what we're going to see in terms of the global economic environment is that some of those things are going to continue to come at us. So supply chain is a good example, right? A lot of us were paying attention in the last year to how many ships were lined up not far from here, right, in Long Beach. I drove down from LAX yesterday past the port, and I was trying to count the number of ships that are waiting, and it's less than 3, right? There was a time when it was above 40 and 50. Those front page problems have disappeared, which is good. But that does not mean that the underlying fragility of the global supply chain has gotten fixed. There's still a lot that has to be fixed that COVID exposed as weak. The question is going to be, who's going to really be the driving force to make sure that happens? I think one of the things, though, when it comes to supply chain in particular, that businesses, especially in the US and Europe, may get more pressure on is, I don't think right now most governments have the ability to look at companies in their country and see end to end, where do their supply chains go? Not just by country, but by investor, by participant. At some point, I don't know that it's this year or next year or even the year after that, but we're going to get to a place where a lot of governments are going to want that kind of visibility into supply chain, which means that companies need to be getting ready for their own sake, but also in terms of their regulatory obligations, to have that kind of transparency. That will potentially help some of the supply chain kinks, but I think I would advise anybody that's sort of listening and watching that they need to not assume that because this isn't a front page issue, it's gone away forever. There's still a huge amount of fragility in the system that somebody and somebodies are going to have to be some of the companies involved are going to have to fix.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ongoing US-China tensions, and low levels of global trust are fueling a spike in protectionist policies, leading to a new point of view in Washington. Namely, national security comes first, interests of US multinationals is second. How are US multinationals responding to this new point of view?
It's interesting in that if you think back to many administrations and many leadership cadres on Capitol Hill going back decades, right? Part of their job, regardless of who's in power or which party it is to create global structures, global agreements, global regulations that can enable US companies to grow and benefit, right? It's part of what they're there for, is some of the supranational challenges. What is happening, though, is that a couple of things are causing this reaction that we are just beginning to see get established in Washington. One of them is, I would say, the foreign and national security policy adaptation to Ukraine, right? Dealing with Russia in a Cold War-like way is a place that DC is very comfortable playing, right? It's been a while since they've been there, but they know how to execute that playbook. Like, they've done it a lot. And it just so happens that a lot of those who are in leadership positions in the executive were leaders during the latter years of the Cold War, right? They know how this works. The problem that they're having a harder time dealing with is the rise of a strategic competitor in China, the likes of which they haven't seen before, right? This is a non-military but economic, technology, diplomatic competitor that we don't have as good a playbook for. And the last thing, of course, that happens right now, as you mentioned, is there's been this ongoing wave of protectionism, particularly in Washington, but in a lot of capitals. What this is doing is it's putting a national security lens in front of a lot of US policies like trade policy, technology policy, commerce policy. It doesn't mean that they're not going to support those policies, but it means that companies need to think about how a US government that is far more focused on national security first is going to view their transactions, their investments, their supply chains, their linkages, their points of view, and how they might enforce either existing regulations or new regulations. I don't know that everybody's ready for this yet, at least not of the companies that I'm talking to, but they're not hiding this either. They are talking in the open about the fact that this is coming. Like, the Commerce Secretary is talking about this, the White House is talking about this, and they are saying explicitly, national security is our job as the government, and companies need to be ready to adapt to what we say in that area. And if they're not listening to that, I think they may be missing some of the signals that are coming out of DC.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for joining us for Policy on Demand.